The morning mist clung to the ancient peaks of the Great Smoky Mountains like a shroud, refusing to lift even as the Tennessee sun climbed higher into the October sky of 1987. Park Ranger Tom Mitchell had patrolled these mountains for 15 years, but something about this particular dawn felt ominous, as if the wilderness itself was whispering warnings that only he could hear. It had been 4 days since college roommates Jake Morrison and Chen had vanished without a trace from their planned backpacking expedition along the most remote section of the Appalachian Trail. Their rental car sat abandoned at the Elkmont trailhead, keys still dangling from the ignition, as if they had stepped out intending to return within minutes. Before we dive deeper into this chilling mystery that would haunt two families for over a decade, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our global community. Now, let's uncover the dark truth behind one of the most disturbing disappearances in national park history. Jake Morrison, 21, was the kind of young man who seemed destined for greatness. A pre-med student at Vanderbilt with a 3.9 GPA, he possessed an analytical mind that dissected problems with surgical precision. His sandy hair caught the light in a way that made him instantly recognizable across campus, and his infectious laugh could fill a room with warmth. Jake had grown up in Nashville's Belmead neighborhood, the son of successful businessman Bill Morrison and psychiatric nurse Margaret Morrison. His friend Chen, also 21, was Jake's opposite in temperament, artistic, intuitive, prone to dark moods that he channeled through his photography. Born in Louisville to immigrant parents Dr. Robert Chen and his wife Linda, Danny had always felt caught between two worlds. His father's expectations of medical school clashed with Danny's artistic soul, creating tension that had intensified during their junior year at Vanderbilt. Their friendship had formed during a chance encounter in the university library during freshman year, two lonely souls finding solace in each other's company. Jake's steady optimism balanced Danny's mercurial nature, while Danny's creativity opened Jake's eyes to beauty beyond textbooks and test scores. They had spent countless weekends hiking through Tennessee's wilderness areas, with Danny capturing stunning photographs while Jake identified plant species and geological formations. The trip to the Smokies had been Danny's idea, though Jake later wondered if some darker impulse had been at work. Danny had been acting strangely for weeks before their departure, waking from nightmares he refused to discuss, spending hours staring at topographical maps of the most isolated mountain regions, and talking obsessively about disappearing from the world. Jake had dismissed these behaviors as artistic temperament and stress from his demanding photography coursework, but now those memories felt like warning signs he should have heeded. Their planned route would take them deep into the park's backcountry, following ancient Cherokee hunting paths through terrain so remote that some areas hadn't seen human footprints in decades. Danny had specifically requested permits for the most isolated campsites, claiming he needed absolute solitude for his photography project documenting the autumn transition in the mountains. The permits were difficult to obtain, requiring special approval due to the dangerous nature of the terrain and the lack of established emergency evacuation routes. On October 15th, they had registered at the backcountry office, with Danny producing detailed itineraries and emergency contact information that impressed the rangers with its thoroughness. Ranger Mitchell remembered them clearly. Jake's enthusiasm about identifying rare plant species that grew only in high-elevation areas of the Smokies, Danny's expensive Nikon camera equipment, and the easy friendship between two young men who seemed to have their whole lives ahead of them. The weather forecast had been perfect for their 5-day expedition, crisp autumn days with clear skies and cool nights ideal for camping. They carried top-quality gear, emergency supplies, and Jake had even brought a satellite communicator, a new technology in 1987 that could send distress signals from remote locations. Everything about their preparation suggested experienced hikers taking appropriate precautions for a challenging but manageable wilderness adventure. On October 19th, when the students failed to check out at the designated ranger station, their absence triggered the largest search and rescue operation in the park's history. Teams of rangers, bloodhounds, and volunteers combed over 200 square miles of treacherous mountain terrain, following every trail, checking every cave, and searching every ravine where two young men might have encountered trouble. What they discovered at the boys' first campsite chilled even the most experienced search coordinators to their core. The tent was found collapsed and shredded, as if something had torn through the fabric from the inside with deliberate fury. Personal belongings were scattered in a wide radius around the campsite, but arranged in patterns that seemed almost ritualistic. Danny's camera equipment formed a perfect circle around the cold fire pit, while Jake's medical textbooks were stacked in a neat pyramid 50 yards away, their pages fluttering in the mountain breeze like desperate signals for help. Most disturbing was a message carved into a nearby oak tree with what appeared to be a hunting knife. "The mountain chooses who stays." The letters were deep and deliberate, suggesting someone had spent considerable time creating the ominous warning. Below the main message, barely visible unless examined closely, were two sets of initials followed by dates: JM 10-17-87 and DC 10-17-87. The handwriting analysis would later prove inconclusive, unable to definitively match either missing student due to the crude nature of carving into bark. But the message sent chills through the search teams, suggesting that whatever had happened to Jake and Danny involved more than a simple hiking accident or animal attack. The pattern of evidence suggested human involvement, but human involvement of the most disturbing kind. Margaret Morrison arrived from Nashville within hours of receiving the call, her mother's intuition screaming that something unspeakable had befallen her son. A former psychiatric nurse with 20 years of experience in emergency rooms and crisis intervention, she immediately recognized signs that the crime scene had been staged. "Someone wants us to find this," she told Detective Lisa Rodriguez, who had been assigned as the family liaison, "but they don't want us to find them alive." Her observation proved more prophetic than anyone could have imagined. The careful arrangement of personal items, the ritualistic positioning around the campsite, and the carved message all suggested a perpetrator who understood psychological manipulation and wanted to send a specific message to whoever discovered the scene. It was the work of someone who had planned this encounter and wanted the families to suffer maximum psychological trauma. Dr. Robert Chen arrived from Louisville in a state of barely controlled panic, bringing with him a collection of his son's recent photographs and journal entries that revealed a young man spiraling into an obsession with death and disappearance. The photographs, taken in the weeks before the trip, showed abandoned buildings, empty roads, desolate landscapes, and disturbing close-ups of dead animals found in local parks. One particularly unsettling series captured the same oak tree where the message would later be carved, taken during what must have been a scouting trip weeks before their planned expedition. Danny's journal entries proved even more disturbing. One entry, dated just days before their departure, read, "Jake thinks this is just a camping trip. He has no idea what I've been planning. Some secrets are too heavy to carry alone, and some friendships require the ultimate sacrifice. The mountains will keep our secrets forever." Another entry described detailed research into missing persons cases in national parks, noting patterns of disappearance and speculating about what might drive someone to simply vanish from the world. The search expanded to include caves, abandoned mine shafts, and forgotten homesteads scattered throughout the mountains. Local folklore spoke of hermits and survivalists who had retreated into the deepest wilderness, living off the grid for decades. Some searchers reported finding strange symbols carved into trees throughout the search area, spirals, crosses, and geometric patterns that seemed to form a trail leading deeper into the most inaccessible parts of the mountains. Bloodhounds followed scent trails that led to rocky outcroppings and then vanished completely, as if the missing students had simply ceased to exist at specific locations. Search helicopters equipped with thermal imaging detected no signs of human life in the vast wilderness, and aerial photography revealed no traces of unauthorized campsites or shelters in the remote valleys and hidden canyons that honeycombed the mountain interior. As days turned into weeks, the official investigation uncovered increasingly disturbing details about Danny Chen's recent behavior and mental state. Classmates reported that he had been researching wilderness survival techniques, studying topographical maps of remote mountain regions across multiple states, and asking strange questions about how long someone could survive in complete isolation without outside contact. His internet search history, recovered from university computers, revealed an obsession with missing persons cases, wilderness disappearances, and psychological studies of Stockholm Syndrome and captivity. The families hired private investigators, consulted with wilderness survival experts, and even brought in a former FBI profiler who specialized in cases involving psychological manipulation and abduction. The profiler's assessment was chilling. The evidence suggested careful planning by someone who understood both wilderness survival and psychological control techniques. The ritualistic arrangement of belongings, the carved message, and Danny's recent behavioral changes pointed to a premeditated event rather than a random tragedy or accident. Winter arrived early that year with a vengeance, dumping 3 feet of snow across the high peaks and effectively ending the ground search, but not the investigation. The case attracted national attention when CNN picked up the story, featuring interviews with the devastated families and dramatic footage of search helicopters battling mountain storms. America's Most Wanted devoted an entire segment to the missing students, generating hundreds of tips from across the country. The families established a reward fund that eventually reached $150,000, funded by donations from the Nashville and Louisville communities, Vanderbilt University alumni, and strangers touched by the story of 2 promising young men who had vanished without explanation. Tips poured in from across the southeastern United States, hikers who claimed to have seen 2 young men matching their description, campers who reported strange encounters in remote wilderness areas, and dozens of psychics offering their services. But every lead proved fruitless, and Jake Morrison and Danny Chen seemed to have vanished as completely as if they had never existed. The investigation consumed thousands of man-hours, involved multiple law enforcement agencies, and cost the state of Tennessee over $2 million. Yet after 6 months of intensive searching, investigators were no closer to solving the mystery than they had been on the first day. Margaret Morrison refused to accept her son's death, maintaining his bedroom exactly as he had left it and returning to the mountains every few months to conduct her own searches. She developed an encyclopedic knowledge of the park's most remote areas, befriending local hikers, mountain guides, and long-time residents who shared information about unusual sightings or discoveries. Her dedication bordered on obsession, but it kept hope alive when official channels had exhausted their resources and moved on to other cases. She learned to read topographical maps with the skill of a professional surveyor, studied weather patterns and seasonal animal behavior, and even took wilderness survival courses to better understand the challenges her son might have faced. Every weekend found her hiking remote trails with a backpack full of missing person flyers, a GPS device, and an unshakable belief that somewhere in those vast mountains lay evidence of what had happened to Jake and Danny. Bill Morrison threw himself into his construction business with desperate intensity, working 16-hour days to avoid the empty spaces where his son's laughter used to echo through their Belle-Meade home. The couple's marriage strained under the weight of their shared grief, with Margaret's obsessive searching creating tension that threatened to tear apart what remained of their family. But somehow their love endured, held together by their mutual refusal to give up hope, and their understanding that abandoning the search would mean abandoning Jake forever. Dr. Robert Chen's response was markedly different. The discovery of Danny's disturbing journal entries and photographs had shattered his image of his son, replacing pride with a mixture of grief and shame that consumed him like acid. His medical practice suffered as colleagues whispered about the possibility that his son had committed murder-suicide in the mountains. The stress destroyed his marriage to Linda, who retreated into alcoholism and prescription drug abuse before dying in a car accident in 1993. The case gradually faded from public attention, joining the ranks of unsolved mysteries that periodically resurface in true crime documentaries and internet forums. But it never left the minds of those who had worked it. Park rangers continued to report occasional strange discoveries, abandoned campsites with ritualistic arrangements of objects, more carved messages in trees, and sightings of figures moving through the forest who vanished when approached. Ranger Mitchell, now approaching retirement, made it his personal mission to check every remote area of his jurisdiction during his patrols. He kept detailed logs of unusual discoveries, a campfire built in a perfect circle of stones in an area where no permits had been issued, supplies cached in waterproof containers hidden in tree hollows, and most disturbing of all, fresh carvings that appeared periodically on trees throughout the most isolated sections of the park. The messages varied, but carried consistent themes. Silence is survival, the weak become strong, and freedom through submission. Each carving appeared to be made with the same type of knife, and the handwriting style remained consistent across all discoveries. Someone was living in the mountains, moving through the wilderness with the skill of a ghost, and leaving behind a trail of psychological breadcrumbs that suggested a disturbed mind operating according to some internal logic. In 1995, the case was officially reclassified as a cold case, though it remained active in the files of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation and continued to generate occasional leads. The National Park Service implemented new protocols for missing hiker cases, including faster response times, expanded search areas, and improved coordination with federal law enforcement agencies. Detective Rodriguez, who had been promoted to sergeant, kept the Morrison Chen file on her desk and continued to follow up on tips and sightings. She had worked dozens of missing person cases over the years, but something about this one haunted her sleep and invaded her dreams. The evidence suggested that Jake and Danny were still in the mountains somewhere, but whether as victims or something else entirely remained a terrifying unknown. The truth would prove far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. On February 14, 1999, Valentine's Day, a detail that would later seem sickeningly appropriate, everything changed in the most horrifying way imaginable. Danny Chen walked into the Gatlinburg Police Department at 3:17 a.m. during the worst blizzard in the region's history, 12 years after his disappearance. But the man who surrendered himself bore little resemblance to the college student who had vanished in 1987. Gaunt and prematurely aged, with wild hair that hung past his shoulders and eyes that seemed to hold terrible secrets, he approached the night desk sergeant with the shuffling gait of someone who had forgotten how to walk among civilization. His clothes were handmade from animal hides, his skin weathered by over a decade of exposure to the elements, and his fingernails were long and yellowed like claws. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, as if he had forgotten how to use it. "My name is Danny Chen," he said, placing gnarled hands on the desk sergeant's counter. "I've been living in the mountains since 1987. I need to confess to the murder of Jake Morrison." The words came out in a mechanical monotone, as if he had rehearsed them thousands of times during the long trek down from whatever hell he had inhabited for over a decade. The confession sent immediate shockwaves through the law enforcement community and devastated the families who had spent 12 years hoping against hope for their son's safe return. Within hours, the police station was swarming with detectives, FBI agents, reporters, and officials from the National Park Service, all trying to process the impossible reality that one of Tennessee's most famous missing persons had literally walked out of the wilderness. Detective Rodriguez, now a lieutenant with gray streaking her hair, found herself face to face with a living ghost. Danny's physical condition suggested years of wilderness survival, but his mental state was even more disturbing. He spoke in that flat, emotionless monotone, describing events with clinical detachment that suggested either severe psychological trauma or complete dissociation from reality. His initial confession was both detailed and horrifying. According to Danny, the camping trip had been planned as an elaborate murder-suicide scheme, conceived during months of psychological deterioration. Consumed by depression, academic pressure, and obsessive thoughts about death and transcendence, he had convinced Jake to accompany him to the most remote part of the mountains, where he planned to kill his best friend and then take his own life. The plan, as Danny described it, had been meticulous in its cruelty. He had drugged Jake's food with sedatives stolen from his father's medical practice, then used climbing rope to bind his unconscious friend to a tree near their campsite. When Jake awoke, Danny had spent hours describing his intentions, explaining how he planned to make Jake's death appear accidental while positioning his own suicide to look like grief over his friend's loss. But when the moment came to complete the plan, Danny claimed, he couldn't go through with the suicide. Instead, he had fled deeper into the wilderness after killing Jake, surviving for over a decade as a hermit living off the land, haunted by guilt and slowly descending into madness. The carved messages found throughout the mountains were his attempts to document his psychological deterioration and mark the boundaries of his self-imposed prison. The confession explained some of the evidence found at the original campsite, the ritualistic arrangement of objects, the carved message in the tree, and the apparent staging of the scene. But as Lieutenant Rodriguez continued her interrogation over the following days, inconsistencies began to emerge in Danny's story. His description of Jake's death changed with each telling, and his knowledge of wilderness survival seemed too advanced for a college student with limited camping experience. Dr. Sarah Thompson, the forensic psychiatrist brought in to evaluate Danny, quickly realized she was dealing with someone who had experienced severe psychological trauma that went far beyond simple guilt over a murder. His responses to questions were often delayed, as if he was translating thoughts from some internal language that bore little resemblance to normal human communication. More disturbing were his physical reactions. Violent flinching when anyone approached from behind, panic attacks triggered by loud noises, and a compulsive need to position himself where he could see all exits from any room. Under hypnosis, and through careful questioning designed to bypass his conscious defenses, a different story began to emerge. One that was far more disturbing than the simple murder confession Danny had initially provided. The truth, as it slowly unfolded through months of therapy and investigation, revealed a horror that exceeded anyone's worst imaginations and explained the psychological devastation written in every line of Danny's prematurely aged face. The truth that emerged from Danny's fractured memories was more horrifying than any fiction. Danny and Jake hadn't been alone in the mountains during those final days in October 1987. They had encountered Marcus Holbrook, a former park ranger who had retreated into the wilderness following a complete psychological breakdown triggered by his wife and daughter's death in a drunk driving accident 5 years earlier. But Holbrook wasn't simply a grief-stricken hermit seeking solitude in nature's embrace. He was a sophisticated predator who had been systematically capturing hikers for years, using his intimate knowledge of the mountains and his ranger training to create an isolated kingdom where he exercised absolute control over anyone unfortunate enough to cross his path. The carved messages found throughout the mountains weren't random vandalism or Danny's psychological deterioration. They were territory markers for Holbrook's twisted domain, warnings to potential intruders and reminders to his captives of his omnipresent authority. Danny's fragmented memories, recovered through months of intensive therapy and carefully administered pharmaceutical assistance, painted a picture of psychological torture that had lasted not days or weeks, but over a decade. Holbrook had used sophisticated brainwashing techniques learned during his military service in Vietnam, combined with isolation, systematic abuse, and carefully calibrated rewards and punishments to break down his captives' resistance and rebuild their identities according to his warped vision of proper human relationships. The process had been gradual and insidious, beginning with apparent rescue and kindness that slowly revealed itself as manipulation. Holbrook had approached the lost college students as a concerned ranger, offering shelter and assistance after they had become disoriented during an unexpected storm. His remote cabin, hidden in a valley accessible only through a treacherous canyon passage, had initially seemed like salvation to two young men facing a potentially deadly night in the mountains. But the salvation had quickly revealed itself as something infinitely worse than death. Holbrook had used his knowledge of psychology and human behavior to systematically destroy his captives' sense of identity and connection to the outside world. He convinced them that their families had stopped searching, that they had been declared dead, and that their only hope of psychological survival lay in accepting their new roles in his carefully constructed alternative reality. Jake, according to Danny's recovered memories, had resisted Holbrook's control longer than most previous victims. His analytical mind and pre-medical training had allowed him to recognize the manipulation techniques being used against them, and he had maintained detailed mental notes about their captors' behavior patterns, the geography of their prison, and potential escape routes. But his attempts to maintain their sense of identity and plan their liberation had ultimately led to increasingly severe punishments from their captor. The final confrontation had come in 1994, 7 years after their capture, when Jake had discovered evidence that they weren't Holbrook's only victims. Hidden in the remote cabin complex where they were held, he found personal belongings from other hikers who had disappeared over the years, a horrifying collection of trophies that revealed the true scope of Holbrook's crimes and the fate of dozens of missing persons whose disappearances had never been solved. Driver's licenses, college identification cards, jewelry, and photographs told the stories of victims stretching back to the mid-1970s. Some were hikers like themselves, others were campers, hunters, or wilderness enthusiasts who had simply vanished without a trace. Jake's discovery of this evidence and his attempt to gather proof for a planned escape had been discovered by Holbrook, leading to the violent confrontation that cost him his life. Danny's memories of Jake's death were the most fragmented and traumatic, requiring extensive therapy to access without triggering complete psychological collapse. Jake had been beaten nearly to death, then left to die slowly over several days as an example to Danny and the few other surviving captives of what happened to those who challenged Holbrook's authority. The psychological trauma of watching his best friend's agonizing death had completed Danny's mental breakdown and total submission to their captor's will. For the remaining 5 years of his captivity, Danny had existed in a state of complete psychological dependence, performing whatever tasks Holbrook assigned, while his original personality slowly dissolved into something unrecognizable. He had helped maintain the compound, assisted in capturing new victims, and even participated in the disposal of those who died or were killed for various infractions against Holbrook's twisted rules. The revelation that Danny had been both victim and unwilling accomplice in additional murders added layers of legal and psychological complexity to his case that challenged every professional involved in his treatment and prosecution. The line between victim and perpetrator had been blurred beyond recognition by years of systematic psychological torture that had transformed a college student into something barely recognizable as human. Lieutenant Rodriguez organized the largest crime scene investigation in Tennessee history to locate and process Holbrook's compound using Danny's fragmented memories and geographical descriptions. The search involved over 200 law enforcement personnel, including FBI agents, forensic specialists, and National Park Service rangers, who used advanced GPS technology and aerial photography to identify potential locations matching Danny's descriptions. After 8 days of intensive searching in conditions that challenged even the most experienced mountain rescue specialists, they found it. The compound sat in a hidden valley, accessible only through a narrow canyon passage that required technical climbing skills to navigate safely. Built from hand-hewn logs and stone quarried from the mountainside, the structures were virtually invisible from the air and perfectly camouflaged to blend with the natural environment. The main cabin was larger than Danny had described in his confused recollections, revealing a complex that had grown over decades of construction. Multiple buildings served different purposes: sleeping quarters, food storage, workshops for making tools and clothing, and most disturbing of all, what could only be described as prison cells carved directly into the mountainside. These stone chambers, equipped with heavy wooden doors and crude but effective locking mechanisms, had held Holbrook's victims during their initial capture and indoctrination period. Inside these structures, investigators found evidence of at least 23 different victims spanning nearly 25 years of systematic abduction and murder. Personal belongings, identification documents, and journals revealed that Holbrook had been systematically capturing and controlling hikers since the early 1970s, perfecting his techniques through experience and developing increasingly sophisticated methods of psychological manipulation. Jake's remains were discovered exactly where Danny's memories had indicated, in a shallow grave behind the main cabin, along with the bodies of 11 other victims who had died during their captivity. The condition of the remains and the evidence found at the burial site confirmed the brutal nature of their deaths. Some had died from violence during escape attempts, others from neglect and exposure during punishment periods, and several appeared to have been executed when they became too difficult to control. Marcus Holbrook's body was found in the cabin's basement workshop, where he had apparently died from a massive heart attack in December 1998. His death had finally freed Danny from the psychological prison that had held him for over a decade, but the damage done to his mind and spirit would take years to heal, if healing was even possible. Medical examination revealed that Holbrook had been in his late 60s, a Vietnam veteran whose military records showed decorations for psychological operations and interrogation techniques. The discovery of Holbrook's compound solved not only the Morrison-Chen case, but also numerous other disappearances that had occurred throughout the southeastern United States over the past quarter century. Families who had given up hope decades earlier finally learned the fate of their missing loved ones, though the knowledge brought more anguish than peace. The FBI established a task force to identify all the victims and notify their families, a process that would continue for years as forensic specialists worked to identify remains and match evidence to missing person reports. For Margaret Morrison, the recovery of her son's remains was both a blessing and a devastating confirmation of her worst fears. The funeral she had never been able to hold finally took place 12 years after Jake's disappearance, attended by hundreds of people who had followed the case and supported the family's search. Jake was laid to rest in Nashville's Mount Olivet Cemetery, his gravestone bearing the inscription, "Beloved son who never stopped fighting to come home." But Margaret struggled with overwhelming guilt and survivor's remorse, tormented by questions about whether she could have done something differently, some sign she might have recognized that could have prevented the tragedy. The knowledge of Jake's suffering during his final years haunted her dreams and consumed her waking thoughts, requiring extensive therapy and medication to manage her psychological trauma. Chen faced the most difficult journey of all. The years of psychological manipulation had left him with severe PTSD, dissociative episodes, and a fractured sense of identity that challenged every therapeutic approach. His recovery required intensive inpatient treatment, multiple medications, and the slow, painful process of rebuilding his connection to reality and to the person he had been before his capture. The legal system struggled with how to handle Danny's case. While clearly a victim of extended psychological torture, he had also admitted to participating in activities that resulted in additional deaths. After extensive psychiatric evaluation and legal debate, he was ultimately sentenced to 20 years in a secure psychiatric facility, with the possibility of release if he could demonstrate sufficient psychological recovery. The case prompted a comprehensive review of National Park Service security protocols and missing person procedures. The revelation that a former ranger had been using his access and knowledge to commit crimes for decades led to enhanced background screening, mandatory psychological evaluations, and improved tracking systems for park employees. New policies required more frequent check-ins for backcountry permits and expanded the rapid response protocols for overdue hikers. In the years that followed, Danny slowly began to piece together fragments of his shattered life. The artistic talents that had drawn him to photography proved to be a pathway to healing, allowing him to process his trauma through creative expression. His photographs of the Smoky Mountains, taken during supervised therapeutic outings, were haunting and beautiful, serving as both therapy and testimony to the resilience of the human spirit. The story of Jake Morrison and Chen became more than just another true crime case. It became a cautionary tale about the hidden dangers that can lurk in even the most beautiful and seemingly safe places. It reminded the public that evil can hide behind familiar facades, and that the wilderness, for all its majesty and peace, can also conceal the darkest aspects of human nature. The Great Smoky Mountains continue to attract millions of visitors each year, their ancient peaks and pristine forests offering solace and adventure to countless hikers and nature lovers. But for those who know the true story of what happened in those remote valleys during the 1980s and 1990s, the mountains will always hold a darker significance, a reminder that some secrets are too terrible to remain buried forever, and that the price of their revelation can destroy lives long after the original evil has been vanquished.